In the I Spy imagery stratagem, we will be teaching students about different types of imagery. We'll also be practicing identifying different types as well as creating some sentences or phrases that utilize imagery. In addition, we will be looking at specific phrases that were used in The Most Dangerous Game where the author used some really very good imagery and analyzing those phrases for evidence of different forms of literacy. The core standards addressed in this stratagem is determine the meanings of words and phrases as they're used in text, including figurative and connotative meanings. Analyze the cumulative impact of specific word choices on the meaning and tone. Likewise, we're also addressing the writing standard, write informative and explanatory text to examine and convey complex ideas. The instructional process occurs in 3 phases. In phase 1, you'll introduce imagery as a literary device. During that phase, you will be sharing with them 4 types of imagery, like similes, metaphors, vivid language, and personification. And then students will be examining various phrases to identify what type of imagery is used in those examples. Also in phase 1, you'll be working with students using different types of imagery to convert boring phrases to phrases or sentences that are much more compelling and appeal to the reader's senses. So for an example, this is page 1 of the I Spy imagery DVD. So you'll be introducing students to the different types of imagery and then analyzing specific phrases to identify what type of imagery is being used in the phrase. For example, the football team was a lawnmower that cut down every other team it played. So that would be an example of a metaphor. He ate like a bear. Obviously, that would be a simile. The girl drove her new car to the grocery store and parked it carefully. She drove her new car. Okay, I'm not seeing any imagery there, so that's an N for not a form of imagery. The little engine tried as hard as he could, but then finally made it to the top of the hill. So that would be a form of personification. Very important during this activity is that you pretty much scaffold the entire process as students analyzing it, because while some students will be familiar with imagery, many won't. Part 2 of phase 1 is taking specific phrases that we think are kind of boring, and then we identify a type of imagery. And so the task is to take that boring phrase and convert it to a much more interesting or compelling sentence that uses imagery in it. So for an example, strong arms. So we want to convert that to something more interesting using a simile. So the example would be Steve's muscular arms were strong as massive iron rods. Another boring phrase is not enough time. So how could you create a metaphor that's all about not enough time? So an example would be, time was the enemy for Elizabeth because she had only an hour to complete a task that typically takes 3 hours. So we're using time was the enemy, and so that's creating a metaphor. You'll be working with students throughout this to help them develop these sentences that utilize these different forms of imagery. Then in phase 2, what we will be doing is looking at the author's use of imagery within the story. So just to explain this DVT, is we'll start with words or phrases used by the author to create imagery, and then we're going to look at how imagery enhance some aspect of the literary work. So to explain this visual, we'll start with words or phrases used by the author that create imagery, and then we'll analyze how that imagery enhanced some aspect of the literary work. So when we're analyzing words or phrases used by the author, we're also going to identify what imagery type. And in this case, we're only looking at 3 types: similes, metaphors, or use of vivid words or language. We'll also identify which senses that form of imagery is appealing to. For an example, whether it's appealing to the reader's sight, hearing, smell, touch, or taste. For an example, the author wrote, "An apprehensive knight crawls slowly by like a wounded snake." That's definitely some vivid words, and it's also a simile. So that's appealing to the author's sense of sight. And now we need to talk about how that imagery enhanced some aspect of the literary work. For an example, so you can see in your mind's eye Rainsford up there in that tree, terrified that Zoroff will find him. The way he wrote this creates a sense of tension. We'll be using 2 other phrases or sentences the authors used where imagery is really compelling, and analyzing those and discussing how that imagery enhanced the literary work. In phase 3, this is a form of summative assessment. Students will be asked to write a paragraph that describes some aspect of their own real life as a teenager and include imagery literary devices in the paragraph. That occurs at the bottom of the DVT. The prompt is life as a teenager. Using imagery in your paragraph, describe some aspect of your life as a teenager, and then explain your image. At the end of the lesson, be sure to pose the essential questions. So have students turn and talk and discuss, how could the imagery DVD be used if you were asked to write a report about this story? And another question you might pose is, what is still confusing about how authors use imagery as a literary device?